Thank you, Flavia. And we have a full morning of discussions, and I want to invite, who's my partner in crime now in organizing this event, Jean-Noël Landry, for you to lead the next panel.
Okay, so my name is Jean-Noël Landry. I'm a Obama scholar from last year's program, and I know that there's a few scholars in the room from this year, so I'm obviously looking forward to meeting you all. So this was a really inspiring discussion and sets of presentations and conversation that we just witnessed. Our panel is going to be on technology and data, which may sound, far from what we've heard right now, but not necessarily. And so if you allow me, I was just kind of taking some notes as I was listening to the presentations, and I'd like to kind of frame up our conversation with our three panelists, just to kind of make a little bit of a connection around the technology and data space and as it relates to hope, but then also some of the kind of cosmology and the kind of spirituality that we were just heard about. So for this panel, we'll focus on data and technology, a dimension of the climate conversation and activism that has profound implications and consequences on our ability to build community and have collective impact. But I also remember a conversation that I had with President Obama when we graduated from our cohort, when I told him about kind of my interests in environmental justice and my background in open data. And it was quite clear, in speaking with him, that you don't just talk about data. If you want to lose an audience, if you want to, and I see the nods, we're like, yeah, don't just talk about data. Don't make it about data. Make it about, the values that underpin it, the justice, the ways that community can be impacted in a positive way through data and technology. And I remember his smile going like, yeah, don't just talk about data. I'm like, okay, President, I won't just do that. So we understand that data and technology can both empower and marginalize, can deepen biases, and help redress systemic issues. It can also create the enabling conditions for collaboration and movement building, or maybe even inter-movement building, on unprecedented scales in human history. And it can also serve as a great set of distraction, challenging our attention, our ability to see and listen to each other. Data and technology is the stuff of power, to kind of riff off David's introductory remarks. But it's often invisible and ubiquitous, and often falls short of giving us the full understanding of the human experience. It is also a construct of our imagination, which we often describe in natural terms. So when we talk in the technology and data space, we often talk about data ecosystems. We talk about data flows, like rivers. And we also talk about data in exploitative terms. And sometimes, from a private sector perspective, talk about data as the new oil that needs to be kind of exploited. Today, we want to bring these tensions to light and reflect on their role on climate action and justice, how our values helps us leverage data and technology to bridge our differences and mindsets. And I have with me today three distinguished guests, and friends, I think, with very different backgrounds. And I've got Andrew, and Andrew, I always struggle with your, and I know this happens to you all the time, so help me out a little bit. Kruczkiewicz. All right, Kruczkiewicz, a meteorologist at Columbia with extensive experience with also internationally with Médecins Sans Frontières. To my left, I have Christian Vanizet, founder of MakeSense.org. And far left, Dr. Christian Brannon, environmental justice research leader who recently started a new position as co-lead of the Environmental Justice and Climate Network of the Earth Institute here at Columbia. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming and joining us today. So let's kick it off with 4 or 5 minutes for each of our speakers to introduce themselves, their work, and the place that technology plays in their work. Then I'll ask follow-up questions for each of them, and then we'll see where it goes. Okay, we'll keep it kind of like open, and we'll obviously end on a hopeful note as well. So I'd like to start with Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, John Noe. So, as mentioned, I am a meteorologist, primarily. Definitely a non-traditional meteorologist. But yeah, I grew up fascinated by the weather and in the 90s, staring at the TV weather radar and not really understanding how things worked or why things worked, or also just like what to do about it. But yeah, just coming from a little bit of background about me. My father is coming from southeastern Poland, a farming family, and they came over to the U.S. Yeah, I never thought climate or weather was really a job. My job as the first one to go to college was work on Wall Street or something, make some money. And it took me a while. I actually worked in the private sector first before going back to studying meteorology and climate as something that was really driving me. And going back to the overarching theme of spirituality, I think that was an important force for me to go back and reflect on what is my role here? What resonates with me? How am I uniquely positioned to help, especially at the intersection of data, weather, and climate, and doing something about it? So most of my work now, well, I would say it's split into 3 elements. I do teach here at Columbia in the climate school. I also lead research. Most of my research is funded by NASA to use satellite data in order to enhance or improve decision-making within the humanitarian sector related to disaster risk management. But then about 1/3 of my time is dedicated to enhancing or improving policy within the humanitarian and disaster sectors. And basically ensuring that the integrity of the data matches the integrity of the decision-making context. And that's really hard, because as scientists, we're trained to be objective. The traditional science approach, especially for climate and the atmospheric sciences, is that the data will unlock at least some objective truths, And we're trained to come up with approaches and methodologies that are data-centric. And actually the incentive, going back to what David was saying earlier, the incentive for scientists is to take the people out of the equation, which is strange now, because I don't want to say now we know how climate impacts people. We've always known how climate and weather impact people. It's just now it's becoming more, I'm not sure what the right word is, but there are increasingly incentives for scientists to engage in the humanitarian sector, engage in decision-making, in policy. But there's risks with that. Scientists don't have the training to understand what those incentives, what the tensions that are inherent within that new incentive to influence the way people live. And this is problematic, not only for, let's say, here in the US, but especially internationally, and that's where most of my work has taken place. So I think we'll unpack this a little bit more, but I think that was what I wanted to start off with, is talk about that as a scientist. It's not as easy as making a map. It's not as easy as making a new forecast. This not only can be meaningless in the humanitarian context, but it could also make things worse. I might have time to reflect later on a story when I was supporting the UN refugee camp managers in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. And I remember vividly some of the stories there that the camp managers were telling me. Basically like, Andrew, we don't need you to make a new forecast. We have too much data and too little time. We need to make a decision, and we need to figure out what to do with the data that we have. There's various levels of forecast products coming from national level services, regional providers, global providers. We just need to know how to make a decision, and we cannot wait. So this has become one of the central elements of my work. You know, scientists like and actually get rewarded for producing new maps and new data sets. But many times, and it's humbling, you know, if you reflect on what is your intention, what is your incentive, and how does that potentially mismatch as a scientist versus like what does it mean to support a community. So I think I'll leave it there for now. And back to you, Jean-Noé.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So and yeah, I've got a few follow-up questions that we'll ask after we do the intros. So over to you, Christian.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's super cool to be back here because I was also Obama Scholar before, the second year, before COVID. So it's the first time I'm back. Anyway, I come from Tahiti, French Polynesia. Anyone have been? No? Great. Keep going. It's a long flight. But yeah, so I come from there. I grew up in Tahiti, and since 10 years I've been doing a non-profit called makesense.org. We mobilize and train community organizers in 45 countries across the world. We help impact startups to start. We manage a 100 million euro investment fund to help them kick off. So I was really in the business of creating solutions and alternatives to show that we can create better business for society and climate. But things changed a bit, so a lot into this technology space. I went to Glasgow at the last COP meeting, and we had a roundtable with President Obama and other activists. And there I met a 24 girl named Luisa Neubauer from Germany. She started Friday for Future with Greta, and you'll see there's like 4 Fridays for Future activists coming for the closing panel that I invited to shake us up because the urgency on climate is real. And Luisa was telling me about this huge, massive oil pipeline that a French company was building in Uganda, which is the country of Vanessa Nakate and Hilda that you're going to see later, and that this French company was building it, and they were looking for support to try to stop this oil and gas pipeline. And so I continue a bit makes sense, but I kind of shifted. And now I'm focusing on what I read was one of the priority from what the IPCC report said, and the scientists, and also the International Energy Agency said that to solve the climate crisis, we can't afford one more new oil and gas project. And so for the last 6 months, I've been focusing on campaigning against this, what we call climate bombs. There's around 420 of them. There's an article about The Guardian, you can look, that are being, the investment is being decided within the next 3 years. If those carbon bombs happen, we're at 3.5 degree, not 1.5. And so it's really like a big urgency to diffuse those bombs. And so there's one campaign, you can look online, it's called the ECOP. That's the campaign we work on with Vanessa and Hilda, which is the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline. Total, for example, the French company has 25 carbon bombs they build, but in every country you have climate activists fighting those new oil and gas. And the approach we do with the data is that the way to diffuse those bombs, it's really hard once they are made, but before they get to find the investment, it's easier to stop them. So we built a coalition of 15 nonprofits across the world, and some of the nonprofits are just focused on getting access to financial data to see which banks might invest or not, but also to track is the emissions that the big oil companies say are compatible with the Paris Agreement, is it true or is it greenwashing? And so basically the transparency on this data on carbon and their commitment, do they follow them, the transparency on the financial data on who is financing which project for how many billions, and how do you measure the carbon emissions. So for example, the big oil, they like to measure just to make their projects, not how it's the oil that's going to be consumed. And so this is becoming super important and the basis of all the actions that then we take against like financial actors, but also these big oil companies. And so this is becoming crucial, like having access to accurate data and seeing what is the greenwashing happening out there will make it that we will or will not make it to keep the Paris Agreement alive. So I've been like, I know it looks like it's the end of the world, but the cool thing is that you'll see the 4 girls coming after. I've worked with activists that are 20 years old, and they scare head of state, they scare big oil companies. We spent 100,000 for campaigning, and the pipeline cost 1.5 billion, so more, because of that. And so it just take a few people, a little bit of money, and then we can stop these carbon bombs with the right data. Sorry, yeah.
It's great. Yeah. Christian.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Christian Branion. I'm a climate scientist and a civil engineer. I've spent about, 15 years now studying climate change. When I started studying climate change, I was a student at Georgia Tech, and faculty were putting out statements affirming anthropogenic climate change to try to dispel misinformation about climate change. And we've come, I think, quite a ways now, and finally we're actually taking some action towards climate change. And I'm shifting now to actually addressing the mitigation dynamic. How do we actually reduce emissions? As I work with climate scientists, what I'm honestly seeing, in the wake of George Floyd, as we have kind of this shift in thinking around racial equity, right? This awakening around racism, is really environmental justice tourism, right? It's climate justice tourism. It's people who've never had a conversation about racism with their children, never had a conversation about racism with their parents, somehow taking advantage of funding and opportunities in this space, all right? And so with my colleagues, what I'm working to do is have authenticity as we engage with communities, not study communities, not treat communities like lab rats, but engage communities at the ideation phase as we think about research projects. Engage communities in a way where there's co-leadership, where they have ownership over the projects themselves. And so recently I was really fortunate to work with an organization called South Bronx Unite, and we collaborated with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association here in the United States to collect temperature and humidity data around Columbia University and northern Manhattan in the South Bronx so that we could highlight disparities in heat exposure in New York City. And when I initiated that project, and I did it in part to be a demonstration for Columbia University, like this can be done, climate scientists, we can do this. I started off by trying to raise funding so we could pay community members for their time, because these projects were actually set up so that community members volunteer their time. It was in the middle of a pandemic. Lots of folks are out of work in New York City, and I wanted to make sure if we did this campaign, and I say if we did this campaign because I wasn't going to do the campaign without community support, we should be able to pay community members. So that was the first step. I found folks at Columbia University to help me raise funds to pay community members if we won the project with NOAA. Then I reached out to community organizations. WEACT, who you worked with, declined. They said, hey, we're focused on other things. We're not focused on extreme heat right now. And I said, that's fine. And I actually thought we might not do the project at all. I'm not open to doing this without a community-based organization support. That's how I'm approaching projects with communities. And fortunately, South Bronx Unite was interested in the project because they wanted to draw more attention to cumulative impact. So South Bronx Unite is known to be a community organization that's focused on air quality issues and lack of waterfront access. And they wanted folks to know about cumulative impact in the sense that they also have extreme heat disparities in their community. So they jumped on board, and their support made the project a tremendous success. Notably, there was another project proposed in Brooklyn that won support from NOAA that failed. They could not get enough volunteers that summer because they did not do community engagement. They did the typical approach that climate scientists often take and folks often take. You wait to the last minute, You tell someone after you've already decided what the project's going to be, the community can have no impact actually on the shape and design of the project, and you call that community outreach, community engagement, right? So what I'm trying to do at Columbia and set the precedent here and other places is to do authentic community engagement, bring communities in at the ideation phase, and allow there to be mutual learning. Because I learned so much actually interacting with the community leaders, Michael Johnson, and others doing this work. So I'll stop there and we'll talk more about this. But I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today.
Thank you very much. And I think we're hearing kind of shifts, right? And people in the way that they do things, or we were doing things before, and the kinds of new incentives in kind of stepping beyond maybe institutional norms or ways of kind of thinking about kind of our positionality with community, and really kind of challenging us to build new alliances and the urgency of kind of the moment to do that in a collaborative way. So that's kind of like a thread that I'm kind of seeing that I think kind of connects us together. I'd like to maybe ask Andrew if he could dig a little bit deeper in terms of the boundaries of kind of knowledge that I know you've encountered, and we've also connected together with WeAct in the sense of, and kind of connects to what Dr. Brennan was also talking about, kind of the community intelligence in a way.
Yes, I'm glad to build off that, and also it's going to echo what Dr. Brannigan was saying. Yeah, so this idea of community engagement or stakeholder engagement, or these various terms that are used to allude to some attempt at co-production or co-development, I actually think many of these examples that are elevated are untrue, and actually are damaging to talk about getting people around a table and like symbolic interaction with decision makers and trusted members of the community as the same as substantive engagement in building trust with the community. And this happens in New York City, it happens internationally, and there needs to be a change in how scientists understand, what their intent is, what their incentive is. And it's not just going to, let's say, a country and talking to farmers and taking up their time. It's knowing how your presence there can have a detrimental impact. And this is usually lost in discussions around co-production or working with the communities. In the reflection of, let's say, even if we just focus on European and North American universities or development organizations, the evaluation of an activity is usually what was our impact, or what were the good things that happened, or how did my map of flood risk, how did this get distributed? But very rarely does it talk about how these data were used, and extremely unlikely for these narratives to include how there were potential detrimental impacts of being present. And that's hard to do, because I do think people care about climate change and people want to do good, but that's not enough. We are influencing the way that communities work. We are taking up space. And I think, building directly off what Dr. Brannigan was saying, yeah, it's up to let's say the higher levels to better assess, what are good examples and what are not. Now there is a trend in climate science, let's say like funding solicitations, to include, or they say you must include how your work is impacting environmental justice. And going back to understanding the limits of the data or the limits of your knowledge, I think it's important for scientists to say, listen, I don't know how to engage with this, and educate themselves in order to potentially engage with it. But yeah, it's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. Another example that I'll give quickly is something that happened here in New York, and this goes back to not only the limits of data, but just the limits of understanding, I'll say disproportionality of impact from a disaster. So last year, I'm not sure if people remember, because actually up in the wealthier parts of New York City, we really didn't see much impact. But from the tropical storm last September, early September, we had devastating flash floods here in New York City. Approximately 40 to 50 people died in the New York area. This was roughly the same amount of people who died in Hurricane Sandy. But there was very different experiences with these two storms. Hurricane Sandy shut down Wall Street. You know, it really impacted the financial sector, tourism sector. Ida really only impacted the lower income communities of Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. And this is where we saw people die in their houses. And if you look at the data, you look at these two storms, you know, you see Sandy as people are talking about it, it led to policy reform, there's research that came out of that. If you look at Tropical Storm Ida, there were some discussions afterwards, but it was largely forgotten. I remember I had to come to Columbia to meet the new cohort of Climate Society students, and no one had even heard of the devastation that happened the day before. And we're here learning about climate and society, and people did not even know. And I remember talking to a few people afterwards, and they're like, well, you know, there was impact. Like, flash floods are happening all over the city. Like, many of us felt impact. And I'm like, listen, I don't care if your car was flooded. I hate to say, if your car was ruined, like, I don't want that to happen. But, like, you're taking up space having discussions about your car being flooded when we had people die in their houses. Like, these are different things. And it's important to remove yourself from the discussion if you really care about addressing these inequalities. So going back to the limits, it's also knowing your personal limits and knowing what it means to take up space in these discussions as distracting from the real challenges, especially if you're talking about being a part of solutions of environmental justice and climate justice.
So I'm gonna build on that because I moved to New York in Harlem last year when those flash floods occurred. And to me, that was a very kind of triggering kind of event and experience as a leader in kind of the more open government and open data and kind of democracy space. And so that created kind of an incentive for me to find a sense of kind of belonging with kind of my surroundings and connect with We Act for Environmental Justice. And so I started volunteering, which was something that I hadn't had the time and kind of, you know, to be able to do as I was kind of leading my organization in Canada. And We Act was mobilizing in creating a process to engage community themselves to understand what are their information and resources needs before, during, and after different types of extreme weather event scenarios. And so I met with them again this week in the context of Climate Week and being here, and they developed this. This is the result. This is the product of this engagement process, and quite proud of it. It's nice to see kind of, and it also speaks to how it is about almost like the social kind of networks and infrastructure that exists in order to build kind of awareness. It's not just technology. It's not just developing an app and kind of making more data available. And so this is called the Climate Ready Uptown Plan, and everything in it is reflective of the engagement process. And I know you can't see it very well, so I'll just briefly describe it to you. So on this side here, and I know you can't see it, but you see kind of flooding before, during, and recovery. And these are all different steps that community members and residents can take in order to prepare for each. So that's on flooding, that's on extreme heat, and the cool thing is the map. So this is a map that shows where flooding and extreme heat happens in the uptown area, and it lists the different steps that you can take to ready yourself and to have a conversation in your household and with your neighbors in order to be better prepared when it happens again. This is not a technology product. This is a kind of a community product that relies on data and the social infrastructure and the networks behind it in order to facilitate that. And so that to me speaks to the experience that you've described. And I remember having a conversation with Andrew and We Act to talk about those the limitations around it and the need for engagement. Now, I'm going to ask you a different question that I had planned, Christian, because you already talked about, and this is my kind of open data kind of hat. I wanted to ask you around kind of issues around data accessibility and data availability, and you've kind of touched on that a little bit. But just hearing our two colleagues, I wonder, how do you engage climate scientists in your activism? Like, how do they fit into the network and the movement and the mobilization that you do? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So there's no. Sorry, I'm a bit monomaniac, so I'm really all on the. Oh, Hilda, you're here. Yes. I'm really focused on these carbon bombs things, and these events like these floodings or these things, they're happening faster than what was expected. And it's happening in places where we wouldn't expect. For example, I come from Tahiti, so the main narrative was my island's going to go underwater. And what happens is that Paris is suffering a lot from climate right now. They had like 4 heat waves in just the summer. So it's starting to hit people everywhere. And so people are starting to realize that what the scientists have been saying for years and years and years is actually real. And what's really useful for us with all the research that do on climate science is that when you look at every campaign, for example, to stop this big oil, wouldn't have the same legitimacy if it wasn't backed by the IPCC report and this data. But the tricky part is that, as you said, like your discussion you had with President Obama, people are not driven by data and science. They need emotions, and when you look at the climate fight, it's not just we need to build the solutions. There's people who don't want it to change, and they use all these tactics or emotions and narratives to play around the reason and the science and the data. And so there's an amazing research paper from a scientist at Oxford who analyzed, the title is Climate Delaying is the New Climate Denying. And it's really interesting. I was talking with a communication expert of the IPCC, and she was listing to me all the attacks the scientists have to try to shape a bit the narrative and diffuse it. And so the transparency over how much emissions they are doing, this will be key to know, like, okay, they are really making us lose time. And the great thing about the climate fight right now is that it's taking more and more to courts. And in courts, you can have these real debates around the real data, the real experts, and this is binding because if you lie, you get condemned. And so it's really interesting to look at the trend that's happening in Germany. Like this young activist, Luisa Bauer, won a case at the Constitutional Court in the Supreme Court in Germany that made the Paris Agreement binding because every citizen in Germany can attack a corporation or a city for not respecting its Paris Agreement engagement. So then in the court becomes, are you really following the trajectory or not? What are they saying? Is it real, not real? And people have to dig into the data. And now it's being used to prosecute. So for example, the police went to the Dutch bank and went to see, do they lie? Or are they real about the data and how much investment they put in fossil fuels? And so this is starting to be a really interesting development. But the main thing that is even more important than the data and the scientists is to put it on the moral ground. So for the ECOP campaign, for example, we went to try to get the Pope to say like this is bad and things like that, because it helps put it on another, and that's kind of linked with the spirituality part. When the Pope say fossil fuels are morally wrong, this have a huge impact on many people who have the faith, and then it makes it that the big oil company can't play anymore with the number. It's morally wrong. It's good or bad. And so this helps a lot. But to get these fights to win, you need the data scientists, you need the science that's super clear, and the IPCC is amazing every time. And then at the same time, you need to build a coalition of allies who are really different and who use all the emotions. So for this campaign on ECOP, we have the Organization of the Pope, you have the Fridays for Future, you have like anti-racism group, because something really interesting that Total is doing, for example, they say, if the French activists don't want this pipeline to happen in Uganda, we are racist because we don't want to let them develop. But at the same time, when people from Uganda say they are against it, like they have like some are put in jail, and they have like, how do you say, like, yeah, it's not easy to be an activist there. So it's really like, how do you shape narratives that engage everyone using the data, the science, but also the religion, and you build these intersectional movements to really fight these people who don't want things to change. And yeah, I don't know if that was a question, but
It's great, yes. No, it's fantastic. I want to kind of invite Dr. Brennan to maybe talk about kind of in a way, what Christian is talking here around, but from an environmental justice perspective, and maybe kind of debunk a little bit the perception of neutrality of data.
Yeah, I mean, there is no neutrality from an anti-racist perspective, right? You're either trying to undo racial hierarchy, right? You're trying to undo racist policies that create racial inequity. Are you actively supporting racist policies? Are you sitting on the sidelines letting racist policies continue, right? So there's no neutrality. It's not helpful to self-identify as not racist. It's not helpful. I'm excited to see many folks in the private sector commit to becoming anti-racist organizations. You know, Uber and others have done that. In the climate science community, there's this discomfort around engaging sometimes around social issues. And to Andrew's point, a lot of climate scientists feel that they don't have the right training, right, to understand the social context. They don't know how to engage with communities. You know, in this rollout of funding that you see coming to integrate environmental justice into climate science research, training is not part of it, right? You can't use those funds to get training on how to do community engagement. Sometimes you can't use funds to pay stipends to community members. So in the work I've done, and I'm really fortunate Columbia has funded some of this, I'm actually training folks in the climate science community on racial equity. We're actually doing training on community engagement. And for me, you know, as someone who's raised practicing a tradition that promotes humanism, that recognizes all human beings are equal regardless of race, gender, class, orientation, I see this as a humanistic action for me to help my colleagues grow and to help myself grow, right? And help myself grapple with the racist ideas I've internalized. And so what we've done is we create a safe space, really a brave space. We have to be brave. we have to grapple with our discomfort and think about how the work we do could create harms, as Andrew was saying, and ask ourselves the question, who benefits from this research, right? Who really benefits? Do low-income communities benefit? Do marginalized communities benefit? Or does the university benefit because I bring these funds into the university? Or does my institution benefit because this superficial touch point around environmental justice was touched in this work? Who benefits? And when this project's over, did low-income communities benefit? And I think another question that we have to grapple with is that we're coming from a place of privilege, right? And we should really take it very seriously, the impact we could have in our work, you know. And so what I would say is this has really come to light in my work with the New York City panel on climate change. I co-chair an expert panel that advises the city of New York on climate adaptation. And what's come up is, how much mapping should we do of coastal flood risk, right? If I put out maps of coastal flood risk around New York City, does that help low-income communities or does that help real estate developers, right? And so what we've actually talked about it and we're thinking through is maybe we actually need to just encourage the creation of affordable housing at higher elevation, do as much as we can to promote that, and delay actually putting out more maps of coastal flood risk because we're not sure the communities will benefit from that. So that's just one example of how I'm thinking about this question you posed.
No, this is great because I feel like we're like redefining professions in a way, and naming a different set of competencies in both sides, right? And we don't necessarily need to look at each other, in terms of silos and disciplines in a strict sense. From what I'm hearing, everybody here is a humanitarian in a way. How do people help people? That's the basic definition of that. So I'm wondering if you have any questions for each other. Like, how do you, for each other on the panel, and if there's questions from the audience, because we haven't really had the opportunity to, so maybe let's take a few questions from the lady over here. Yeah, coming to you. And please introduce yourself as well, please.
Thank you so much for these really inspiring remarks. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm a historian of science and director of the Center for Science and Society. And I have two questions, one for Dr. Brannian. Thank you very much for your interest in co-production. We also at the Center for Science and Society have moved in that direction, along with the climate school and some of the climate scientists. One of the problems with engaging in co-production is that scientific research is funded by grants that have a very short timeline, and building the trust of a community and then engaging with them in research takes much longer than most grant funding allows. And so although we've seen it with the NSF, for example, this move towards community engagement, it hasn't been recognized in kind of, the length of their grants. That's my first question for Dr. Brannian, and then I also have a question. I have one more question, if I may. Should I ask that now?
Yes, please.
Okay. This question of transparency of data. So I believe it is the case that armed services in almost every country, so national defense, is not counted within the carbon emissions, are not counted as, in any sort of transparent way, and are not counted as part of, targets for lowering. And I just wonder if you're working on that at all in your work, Dr. Vanizette.
Not doctor yet.
I know, but you sound like it.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So, it takes time to develop trust, and a lot of these communities, community-based organizations have been burned, right, by working with universities, even nonprofits, certainly the private sector. The way I approach this, and the way I would encourage folks to approach this, is start the conversation well before the grant solicitation comes out. And even though there's some time associated with building that trust and developing like a true partnership, once you've kind of overcome that initial upfront cost in terms of time, now you have this partner that could last, right, really for decades or for years. So for me, I started this conversation with South Bronx Unite. Some of my colleagues that jumped on from Columbia University already had worked with South Bronx Unite. We worked on the Urban Heat Mapping campaign, and that was just the beginning. We didn't know where it would go. Now we're doing technical assistance around creating more access to the waterfront in the South Bronx. Recently, funding opportunities have come up around technical assistance. We think we could apply to that, but we started helping them with that before we even knew where the funding would come from. So I would say to you, make it an authentic partnership. And for me, that usually starts with just going to the community meeting and just sitting and observing. And just myself trying to understand what are the underlying issues in the community, where do they see challenges, where do they see opportunities, and coming with my expertise to see how climate solutions could align with those. So I would encourage folks, just come in and be a fly on the wall and start that conversation before there's necessarily a clear funding opportunity there.
I would also maybe add, some of the some of the work that I'm doing in Canada right now around building an inter-university data studio focused on the ecological transition, which really goes to the heart of how academics themselves are able to share knowledge and data and kind of changing the types of incentives around research and timelines, and really kind of, looking at the licenses of data, right? And like, there's a lot there that can be done, and putting more data out in the open so that we don't duplicate effort. So it's not about the research kind of self-interest. And I think that speaks to engagement. If academics are able to do that themselves, it creates a kind of fertile ground to be able to collaborate and to come together as well. I think that sends a message, an invitation, that we're in a time right now that we all need to do things differently in order to mobilize at the scale that's required. And so how are you, I want to answer the second question as well. Go ahead.
So there's a really interesting website, it's called Carbon Tracker, and you can track, and the data is available. I haven't seen yet people tracking the military of a state in terms of carbon. I think could be a really interesting campaign if you tie it with countries leading by example on all sides. I've seen citizens doing something that became really famous in France. They track the carbon impact of the travels of billionaires, because you can follow the planes. And this created a big debate in the public opinion, so I think it's something really interesting. But the question that is also behind is the question of democracies and rise of authoritarianism in the world right now. And we can clearly see it's really hard to mobilize and stop oil and gas projects when it's happening or financed by banks in authoritarian regime. And I think the question of democracy and climate will be really tight, because it's going to be complicated to solve these issues. So for example, on this pipeline, the East Africa, it's really hard to put pressure on the Chinese bank, so they don't finance. And in China, you don't have the same tool that you can have in the US or in Europe to put pressure on those banks. And so these two things are going to become strong soon. And I think the narrative of like countries and on the thing they manage, which is their army, how are they doing? You can see who is really walking the talk or not. That could be interesting.
Does any country track military carbon emissions?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, exactly. So let's work on that. I think it points also to the, because you talked about the rise of authoritarianism, right? And also the kind of trade-offs that are now kind of happening, right? And like civil kind of liberties when you have these governments, and some of the powers that governments have taken on during the pandemic, and that they don't want to give up. Because now it's very difficult to kind of give up, power once you have it. And, I like to say that, in the climate emergency, this is a moment for doubling down on open government. And unfortunately, we're seeing a backsliding of open government initiatives and commitments that have taken, over a decade, 2 decades to build up. And I will call out the US government for not moving forward with its action plan, its national action plan, as an obligation to its membership within the Open Government Partnership. And so that's something that, for the Americans that are in the room, there's a commitment there that's not being fulfilled by a White House that has made commitments towards climate justice and climate in general. More questions? Okay, over here, one, and then over here. We'll take a couple. How are we
Hey,
for?
okay. I have a question about the moral standard, what moral standard we should be applying here, and what y'all's perspective is, and what competencies are required to fulfill the moral standard we think is appropriate for this moment. My personal analysis is that unless we're planning for the total survival of everyone on Earth right now, we're implicitly endorsing genocide. And I feel like the example of the storm in New York was, I thought of a new term, microcide. The small ways that people are sacrificed in climate impacts. And so, yeah, I'm curious what you think, what moral standard our governmental and practices should be adhering to, and what competencies are required to shift in order to achieve that moral standard.
Well, I'll jump in there. In the past, I've talked about the moral imperative to act around climate change, and I usually focus on deaths and hospitalizations around climate change. I think people can resonate with deaths from extreme heat in particular, right? Hospitalizations from extreme heat. I think the harder conversation is around people on the complete opposite side of the globe. And the tension, I think, right now is that as we take action on climate change, we've got to do deep decarbonization, across the energy sector. And yet, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we also need to do carbon dioxide removal. We actually also need to use technologies that remove legacy emissions. And there's a climate justice imperative for wealthy countries, right, in that we actually became wealthy after colonizing many of the low-income countries, right? So we should really be pushing those technologies forward associated with carbon dioxide removal. And here in the U.S., frontline communities and communities with environmental justice challenges are concerned, right, about the infrastructure and technologies associated with carbon dioxide removal and what the implications could be for their communities. So I think there's some tension in that. For myself, as someone with family in New Orleans, I'm really concerned about folks that are bearing the brunt of the air pollution and other pollution associated with the oil and gas industry, in Cancer Alley, for example. And yet, I really don't, I'm Pan-Africanist in my perspective, and I don't look at folks of African descent in Uganda any different than folks of African descent in Harlem, or in New Orleans. And so morally, I think we have to not just think about folks in our backyard when we think about environmental and climate justice, but we've got to think about folks across the globe and somehow find solutions that allow us to address greenhouse gas emissions, through decarbonization, through removing legacy emissions, without making sure that any harms that come from new technologies that we deploy can disproportionately impact communities that are already overburdened with pollution. So this is kind of like what I'm struggling with and what I'm thinking through. But I think there's really a moral imperative for us to not just think about folks in our backyard. We've got to think about the folks that will be disproportionately impacted by climate change in countries with less wealth than this country.
So, one of the themes discussed today, I don't know if it's on here, hope, is it part of the title?
Yeah, it's here.
So I hope this helps. And I'm saying that, I never used to think much about that term before, but it has been a reoccurring term, phrase in my career, and is something that, for the reasons I'll share, I think is problematic on a variety of fronts. So part of my role with humanitarian organizations is acting as a filter of climate information, forecast information, risk information specific to disasters. It's an extremely privileged space to operate in because I'm a scientist translating and interpreting forecasts down to decision makers in refugee camps, in migration contexts, conflict settings, these sorts of things, and they're overwhelmed by the amount of data. I think many here can understand that there are different forecasts. There are different forecasts for Fiona that's coming up the coast right now. We see different tracks. There's a variety of tracks. Which one do you use? Which one do you trust? These are the questions that I support. And it's on one hand, it's impossible, to remove yourself from the subjectivity and the biases that you have. So you have options. You could ignore and think you're acting objectively, or you could try to understand those biases, even in that space of translating, interpreting. But going back to, and this does speak to the moral imperative of of influencing these types of situations. Yeah, I'm thinking specifically to the Rohingya refugee context again, but this has happened in various locations. But I remember I was there for a few weeks in 2017 when there was 800,000 Rohingya moving very rapidly into Cox's Bazar, southeast Bangladesh. And they asked me to support, the UN refugee camp managers asked me to support development of a disaster risk management plan, early warning system type things. And at one point, we were in a meeting, and they were like, Andrew, we're having, like, everyone really wants to help. You know, we're getting emails from Sweden, from Stanford, from NASA, from the Japanese Space Agency. Everyone has these flood risk maps, landslide risk maps, forecasts for tropical cyclones. We don't know which one to trust, you know. And I'm like, okay, well, let's see what's available. I'll do my best. I mean, if I understand, I could say something to it. If I don't understand, I could say I don't understand, you know. Like, this is an important part of being a scientist operating at this interface. But I remember they sent me some of the emails, and for some reason, being there and knowing the stress of the people making the decisions of which refugee camps to prioritize, and understanding in that moment, that also meant making decisions on which camps to deprioritize. Like, what is my role in that situation in influencing who doesn't see benefit? You know? And I remember reading some of these emails from really smart people, right? And people that I think really cared. And they always ended the emails with, I hope this helps. Here is a flood risk map we developed with this very new fancy forecast. It's very, very accurate. I understand things are very complicated in Cox's Bazar. Here's our map. I hope this helps. And I remember thinking, like, do you? Do you really care if this helps or not? Like, you hope that perhaps you'll get credit, or you could tell the story of helping a refugee camp. That's what you hope. Because if you really cared and you really hoped it helped, you would ask questions. You would listen. You know, you wouldn't just send this to people. So I just wanted to reflect on that, because I think it's relative to this, and it speaks to a lot of the themes we're talking about. It's present here in the US, and it's present in many parts of the world as well.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It almost speaks to the need for a Hippocratic oath around, you know, the way that data can have some life and death kind of repercussions as well. Did you want to touch a little bit? No, Seba? I saw a couple. Let's take a couple of questions in, like, okay, there's like one here, one there, one there. And let's take like three, I think, because we're going to be kind of wrapping up pretty soon. So over here.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you all. And I'm Fabiola. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I co-founded a software company to visualize environmental risks. I'm also a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and I just came here after Fiona to be in the New York Climate Week. And I've been hearing lots of panels and conversations, and there's this underlying question I've had through the whole week, which is, I know that for us in the Caribbean, it's just a matter of time for the next storm to hit, right? And we should share the responsibility of guaranteeing equal access to climate capital for countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change, right? But not enough people are talking about that, I think. I mean, we mention it, but I remember in the New York Times, nobody, even though it happened 2 days before the event, nobody mentioned Fiona or Puerto Rico before I just, like, you know, asked the question. And I'm wondering, because we have this title, Climate Hope and Science, my family right now is like, they don't have much hope. We still don't have running water or electricity. And how do you tackle this question of unequal access to climate capital for countries where the crisis is pushing beyond adaptation, where people feel that what there is to do next? And yeah, for me, it's like a question that I've been having through all these panels, and I was wondering if you guys could help me a little bit on that. And also, Andrew, I was on the webinar on Tuesday, and I was really impressed when you talked about the intersection between science, policy, and practice. And I was wondering if you could shed a little bit of light in that. And thank you so much for the conversation. It was amazing.
So my name is Juliana, and I work on a program that supports initiatives in forests globally, based in Brazil. And the program I work with has a market-based approach towards looking into forests, for example. So it's pretty much the discussion on nature-based solution and forest and nature as an asset. And the same way I see around lots of discussions on carbon markets and such approach. And I wanted to hear your comment on the reflection on climate delaying being the new climate denying. How much do you see that market-based approach, carbon credits, nature as an asset, can all be great ways for us to give the private sector more tools to make more money out of the climate discussion and transform this into climate delaying?
Let's take another one. Let's take another one. The lady over here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Gail Lynch, and I work at Columbia for the Center of Undergraduate Global Engagement, and I run a virtual global engagement program for students. And my question is, I guess for Dr. Branian and maybe others, but when you were talking about it's about opportunities, I guess, that come with climate change, if you could put it in sort of a hopeful type of way. But a lot of jobs will be coming up, or I think about when you were talking about, involving the community and actually giving stipends to community members. That's an opportunity to get involved. So my question has to do with how do we offer these opportunities, whether it's jobs or community engagement stipends, in a just way for people? How can the climate change will bring many jobs. How do we make that just transition?
Okay, so let's try to answer these questions. And I hate to do the moderator thing where you look at your clock and you know that there's another great session afterwards. And I think the following session is probably going to be answering the capital kind of mobilization a little bit more, but I don't want us to not answer that here as well. So who wants to go first? Pick your question.
So I'll jump in. I'm going to try to tackle the climate delay question and that last question at the same time. I was a skeptic of carbon markets. I used to work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and Office of Environmental Justice, and I worked quite a bit on the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. And I was engaged with communities, and there was a portion of that, the Clean Energy Incentive Program, that aimed to make sure that the benefits that come from the environment, solar energy, for example, that was prioritized in low-income communities and communities of color, right? So the Obama administration was thinking about how do you make sure there's a just transition. When I would go to talk to indigenous leaders, they were dead set against any carbon market-based solution, and they were generally against the Clean Power Plan. And I felt a little bit disillusioned about the Clean Power Plan at that time. Fast forward after the IPCC's 1.5 degree C warming report, it's quite clear we do need to remove carbon dioxide, or it's unlikely we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius in terms of global warming, and that means ecosystem collapse, right? That means that in some places, for example, the Mesoamerican reef, 70% or more of those coral reefs are going to die, and that's going to devastate those communities, right? And so carbon markets can be a way to incentivize carbon dioxide removal. Carbon offsets are part of that, but it has to be done the right way. I'm really excited to see the Department of Energy tie lots of their new funding around carbon dioxide removal technologies to environmental justice by requiring community benefits plans. And so if you're familiar with construction in the United States, a lot of times communities just find out that something's being installed in their community, they're not engaged meaningfully, folks in the civil engineering industry and in the construction industry are just checking the box and doing the bare minimum around community engagement. So I think one way to make sure that the carbon management industry doesn't follow the same path that really the civil engineering industry and the construction industry has followed is to make sure that there's meaningful benefits for communities, develop community benefits plans, and really be transparent about how they're reviewing projects and ensuring that there isn't greenwashing, right? That folks are doing everything they can to reduce their carbon footprint, right? Decarbonizing their supply chain and their businesses, and then purchasing carbon offsets and purchasing carbon credits to be net zero and even move towards negative emissions, right? So I think the carbon management industry has to really do their part to ensure there isn't greenwashing and be transparent about how they're doing that. And that's part of the reason why I decided to take on the role I've taken as head of climate justice at Carbon Direct, is because I could tell that the carbon management industry, and Carbon Direct specifically, realizes the industry will not take off unless social justice is embedded into our work.
Yeah, just to rebound on your two questions and on what you just said, independently from the solutions and the big ideas, what I've been seeing over the years is that every system that's being built, the people who win a lot of money by needing to put carbon, they will sneak around. And so the hard part is to hold them accountable on their numbers, so the data transparency, and there's not going to be binding mechanism fast enough. So we have to find creative ways to force it to happen in making our own binding ways. So yesterday, for example, the first time I heard about Fiona was at this protest in front of BlackRock. And so people were in front of BlackRock, were telling them, stop funding deforestation, you fund this energy company, but then it doesn't provide energy to the people. When there's this disaster, it will continue. And what was really interesting was just 20 of us protesting in front of BlackRock, singing song to the CEO, which was in the building, is at the same time, the New York controller for the pension fund of the city sent him a letter and say, if you don't change, I'm going to take the 43 billion of the pension fund of the city that we place in BlackRock, and we're going to put it somewhere else. It's the same thing that Luisa did in Germany with this thing winning the case in the constitution. All these activists that are like, you're going to hear them and see them after, and they can explain. We don't trust the leaders or the systems anymore. We have to make it happen and find creative ways, and it doesn't mean being violent or whatever. It just means being smart in how you make all those things like some forms of pressure and binding, and starting with the financial markets. For example, this pipeline in Uganda, we can't just say the government of Uganda, stop this thing, and then you don't have investment. So at the same time, we have to lobby the French Development Bank. We have to ask the Americans, because there's a Chinese company, they don't want a Chinese company, hey guys, what if you come together and provide some billions for renewable energy? And at the same time, Total, the oil company, is saying we want to be a renewable energy leader and transform ourselves. They say, okay, so instead of doing a pipeline, just invest in Uganda, if you care about the people there, as what you say, into renewables. And so all these pressure of making sure financial actors stop, but at the same time encouraging new things are really important. And the transparency of the data will be key, because I remember in France, when they started the carbon market, 1/3 of it was fraud. And so it meant that the taxpayer money of the French people was used to give subsidies for fraud. And so the transparency around all of that and the numbers are going to be super key, and especially the number of the carbon emission, to avoid drinking the narratives that could be delaying narratives. And the thing that makes me really hopeful is that the court are starting to take all this case. And if you're a financial institution and you lie about this thing, it becomes fraud to investor. And then you're in big trouble. And so these things are starting to happen all around the world. Then when a CEO can go to jail because he's lying or doing something bad, usually they stop doing these bad things. So at the end of the day, I think the more we push for campaigns that put this pressure, the more these amazing ideas will have real lasting impact.
So you've introduced hope, and I think I'm going to ask Andrew and Christian, Dr. Brennan, to also maybe tell us what makes you hopeful as we wrap up, and then we're going to finish.
You know, what makes me hopeful is that, to your point, I'm seeing much more accountability around climate mitigation. I was very inspired to, I believe it was it Denmark or Finland, committed funds towards loss and damage recently. That inspired me, that wealthy countries are acknowledging that they have more responsibility for our climate crisis, and it makes sense for them to contribute more money because your wealth is built off of the countries you colonized, is built off of colonization, is built off of slavery. And so I'm really hopeful to see more movement around loss and damage, recognizing loss and damage impacts. And as I enter the carbon management industry, I'm really hopeful because I see that my colleagues are very serious about environmental and climate justice themselves, and they see carbon dioxide removal technologies and other technologies as a way to lessen the impacts on low-income countries. So I'm hopeful and I'm energized, and I want to work more closely with Christian and Andrew and you, John Noe, as we move forward.
Andrew.
Yes, so I'm struggling with this question because regarding disasters specifically and disproportionality related to disasters, I'm really not hopeful right now. I think they're happening more frequently. The impact profiles are changing. We're seeing the disproportionality of impact growing. And until we are clear about what our forecast systems do, to decrease that disproportionality, what our early warning systems do to enhance or decrease that disproportionality, to call things what they are, do better at calling things what they are related to disasters, then I actually really don't have hope. I'm sorry for that, but that's true. But bigger picture, I do have hope. Let's say bigger picture climate change. I do have hope because it is becoming more mainstream in terms of the narrative, It is, there are people thinking more about loss and damage. I don't know, I just heard that in the upcoming COP, perhaps loss and damage will not be as big of an issue as it could have been, but it is gaining traction. So I do think so. But I'm taken back to some discussions I've had with the humanitarian sector, specifically around too much data, too little time. Are we just patting ourselves in the back and making more data available? Or are we really thinking about, what do we need to do now to address disproportionality of impact, which increasingly we are seeing through disasters? And we're seeing this. To address your question about Fiona, we should have known better with Fiona. This was something that we saw. We had the forecast, especially for rainfall. These are the fingerprints of climate change on tropical cyclones. We're seeing wetter, slower moving cyclones, perhaps not even reaching hurricane intensity, but having devastating impacts. We have forecasts for rainfall. We don't need to look only at the strengths of the winds, especially in areas where the wind is not going to do the most damage. So I think I'm very glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking a lot about even how we name these tropical cyclones. Mm-hmm. These naming systems were developed in the 1970s. And guess who were the scientists back then that developed those things? It's not a diverse group of people. So I think we need a reset on that. And there are people thinking about naming tropical systems. What does it mean for people to perceive the risk and actually take action? But yeah, I'll tell you, the forecast for the heavy rainfall in Puerto Rico, that was known. We knew that. It's just, why was this message communicated only as a tropical storm? Oh, it's only going to be a tropical storm. People perceive that as it won't be as severe as a hurricane. And I think that was a big factor there. It was a big factor in Sandy here, where it wasn't quite a hurricane. It was this in-between superstorm thing. So I think, I guess that's a reaction there too. But it does give me hope. The bigger picture things do give me hope. But specific for disasters, we need to do better and understand disasters do affect everybody. It's kind of like the COVID thing. Sometimes people say, oh, COVID touched us all. Yeah, but guess who it really hurt more than the wealthy populations? It's the same thing with disasters. So we need to come to terms with this. And that's one of my main messages.
And I would say, if I may, for me, what gives me hope, I think it's conversations like these, the solidarity that we're kind of hearing and the reciprocity in ways that we're able to kind of, we talk about scaling, but like scaling deep, to have that kind of mindfulness and thoughtfulness and recognizing the interdependencies and the kind of shared kind of competencies that we have to bring, to fight this off and to do the best that we can. So, thank you very much.